will have trickled in. So welcome to the CAIS USC Center for Artificial Intelligence and Society seminar series. We have this semester, we have a few speakers as we did last semester. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York at Buffalo, which is actually very close to where I grew up because my dad was a professor there back in the day. So it's always kind of fun to have somebody from the hometown for me. She is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard University, a faculty fellow for the Center for Democracy and Technology, as well as a member of the Twitter Academic Research Advisory Board. So she is doing a lot of moving and shaking in the world of AI and machine learning for social good. Her work lies at the intersection of computational social science, demography, and social policy. And I'll let Dr. Rodriguez introduce her talk and take it away. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. And if you give me a thumbs up if you see that. Excellent. So thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. What I'm going to do is talk about what I see as the root of algorithmic bias and how I think we can start to deal with it. And just to give you a broad overview, we're going to start with a few acknowledgements and a maybe more formal welcome. I'm going to give you an introduction to some of my work writ large, and then sort of dive into algorithmic bias and relatedly AI for social good. I'm going to talk about what I see as the root problem and what I see as the first step in a potential series of solutions, and summarize that and then open it up for comments and questions and critiques and so on. So first, I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. I live and work on their land, which is located in Western New York, and I am giving this talk from there as well. If we were meeting in person at USC, we would be standing on the traditional lands of the Tongva people, and I'd like to offer my thanks to them and to their ancestors. And I also want to share with you my positionality because it informs not just my work, but also what I'm sharing with you today. So I identify as an Afro-Latina, cis heterosexual gendered woman. I also identify as the daughter of 2 generations of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. My ancestors were the Taino and the Arawak people, West African people, who were kidnapped and enslaved predominantly from Benin, Togo, and the Congo, and who recreated their home as best they could in the land known then as Haiti, but now known as the island of Hispaniola, as well as the colonizers who made their home in the Dominican Republic, the Spanish and the Portuguese predominantly, among others. And so with all that, I'd like to welcome you to another video talk, and I'm grateful that we have an opportunity to meet today via Zoom. So I'd like to encourage you to enjoy a warm or cool beverage as the weather dictates while I share with you some of my thoughts. I want to further preface this talk by saying that what I'm going to be sharing with you is really my understanding of what I believe to be the principal issue in algorithmic bias and what I think we should do about it. So any errors or omissions are completely my own. And an additional disclaimer is that I might say 1 or 2 cuss words whilst doing this talk. And so if you have any small children around, please email me and let me know how much to contribute to your swear jar. So with that, here's sort of where I'm coming from. On the left-hand side, you'll see some snapshots of some of the work I've done that's at this intersection of computational social science, demography, and human services. On the right-hand side, you'll see practice experience that in essence goes back just shy of 20 years. So Ethical algorithmic decision-making in human services is one of my primary research areas, and it's informed by my practice experience. As you can see, I've sort of run the gamut from working with youth, sort of troubled youth, all the way through case management at homeless services, through community organizing. And the reason this is important and that I highlight it here is that in social work, folks who are interested in pursuing PhDs are often advised to make sure they have at least 2 years of post-MSW experience, 2 years of work experience after achieving their master's. And one of the reasons for that is because of our accreditation standards. So in order to teach social work practice, one must have practice experience. But the second and maybe less talked about reason is because it helps ensure that whatever research a doctoral student comes in to begin is informed by some kind of contextual or ground truth knowledge based on personally touching the problem that they're seeking to study. Of course, it's not comprehensive, but there's some sort of familiarity there nonetheless. And so this graphic is maybe what a lot of people think about when they think about algorithmic bias, right? And sort of concretely, algorithmic bias is defined in a couple of ways. One is, systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes. Another is outcomes that are sort of systematically less favorable to individuals within a particular group, and where there is no relevant difference between groups that justifies those harms. And then sort of more broadly, there's an understanding of algorithmic bias as just amplifying inequities in society. And this sort of depiction here, it kind of speaks to that. The general idea being that there's this mountain of terrible stuff that exists in the world, and algorithms serve to perpetuate it because most of us are limited in our understanding of all the processes that undergird society to make it function the way that it currently does. And so rather than mitigate it, we've really kind of updated the shit so that it's technologically sparkly. And I think that the issue is maybe just a bit deeper. And I want to illustrate that by using the movement that we all maybe know colloquially as AI for social good. And so there's a lot of these initiatives coming up across the country. Of course, we're being hosted today by also a center that bears this in their title. And the idea behind AI for social good, at least to my understanding, is kind of twofold. One is it sort of serves to improve publicity for AI, right? Sort of this notion that technologists aren't just out for profit, but they're really looking to apply the kind of magic of AI to intractable social problems, and presumably to our benefit, right? To the benefit of the public good. And the second is that it allows for end users, meaning all of us, to feel more comfortable with all of our data being churned sort of with or without our consent in service to this greater good. Though the greater good is sort of a bit nebulous, right? Is it my greater good? Is it your greater good? Is it the collective's greater good? Is it the collective good of marginalized folks? Whose social good are we thinking about? In the case of organizations, we generally get this kind of information, the answers to those questions, from their mission and value statements. But sometimes those can be a little cloudy as well. So here are just two examples. One is from Google AI for social good. All of the things happening at Google right now notwithstanding, we can see from their mission statement, Google believes that AI can provide new ways of approaching problems and meaningfully improving people's lives. The NOR's IPS AI for Social Good workshop is maybe a little bit more targeted in that they use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which range in broad areas, for example, poverty, environmental justice, and so on. But of course, across the board, we might think of this lack of specificity as an issue, especially when we're considering whether and how AI might in fact be used for social good. So again, we come to the question, well, what is social good? And how do we know that we're doing it? And it's in this vein that I want to talk about algorithmic bias, right? There's been a lot of arguments in the literature, both methodologically, theoretically, philosophically, conceptually, about, well, what is bias really? How do we know that we're not doing it? How do we know that we're dealing with it? Can we deal with it? How do we deal with it? And in my opinion, which again is based on my research and my practice experience together, as well as my own positionalities, the answer really depends on what you think that algorithms can best be used for. And I really think that there's one thing that AI can potentially do to help us alleviate what policy scholars call wicked problems, or what we started this talk off by labeling as sort of intractable problems. And so to be clear, I tend to agree with folks who argue that algorithms can help us simplify parts of our lives so that we can get to the good stuff. So for example, as soon as there were robot vacuums available, I said, sign me up for 3. Whoever is working on the robot duster should really reach out to me, because I'm happy to be a beta tester so long as it is not a drone. An automatic dog pooper scooper, that sounds great, sign me up for that. And as soon as somebody figures out autonomous vehicles, I will think really hard about it and probably throw my money at them very quickly. So this sentiment, right, has been expressed by a lot of other folks. And there's some different books that we can think about, the power of algorithms, the power in algorithmic thinking. The general sentiment is something like, algorithms are really just step-by-step methods for decision-making. And presumably they are more transparent because they are mathematical. And as a result of being mathematical, they're therefore more logical. So we should be using algorithms to deal with these tedious things so that we can, start to live our lives. The problem, of course, is that what I just kind of described isn't really basic needs. They're really tedious, specifically middle-class needs, but we confuse them as basic because we don't really worry about where our next meal is coming from. A lot of us don't have to worry about how we're going to pay the rent or whether we can afford to go to work tomorrow. And so AI for social good, in my opinion, should really be channeled towards increasing our ability to intervene at these 2 base tiers in this pyramid: physiological and safety needs. And just as a bit of background, what this is depicting is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the idea behind this, is that in order to be fully realized human beings, we have a series of basic needs that we need to meet. And after we meet those basic needs reliably, predictably, then we can start to think about more complex things like why we're here and how we relate to other people. And so the bottom 4 tiers, physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, and esteem, are generally understood as deficiency needs. And deficiency needs arise as a result of deprivation. And they're said to motivate people, especially when they're not met, right? So the motivation to fulfill those needs will become stronger the longer that those needs are being denied. So for example, the longer a person goes without eating, the hungrier that they will become. And so really, if we're working to define AI for social good, my argument here is that we should be thinking about dealing with those basic things, those things that take up so much cognitive load in the lives of people, such that we can then get to those higher things by dealing with those sort of tedious everyday, picking up dog poo, dusting, and so on, so that we can then sort of work our way up this pyramid. And what's important about this visualization here is that these are cumulative. So there's no way that I can start thinking about my safety unless I know for a fact that I have water, food, shelter, clothing, right? That I know that my kids are safe, so forth and so on. And I can't start thinking about loving, belonging unless I know that I'm safe, right? That I have enough, so forth and so on. And so some of us might think, well, maybe this is kind of what we're trying to do already, right? We're trying to predict, for example, we're trying to equitably address healthy food distribution, or predicting homelessness, for instance, or what have you. But here's where I want to sort of complicate things a little bit more, and it has to do with the problems as I understand them in terms of how a lot of efforts maybe are currently approaching these issues. And the first is that, in my opinion, the root of algorithmic bias is that we built modern society for people at a very specific intersection of identities and quarantined everyone else. And this is a historical reality that we must agree on if we are in fact interested in AI for social good. This specific criteria of importance, of course, is wealthy, Anglo-Saxon, cisgendered men who are Christian and Protestant, right? I'm going to illustrate this by giving you a short history lesson on the roots of 3 public systems, many of whose data you all may be using in the name of increasing social good, and as a result in decreasing bias in algorithmic development. So the first is the orphan trains. The orphan trains existed between 1854 and 1929, and they moved approximately 250,000 homeless children into foster care, predominantly by moving them from cities, certainly in the beginning, New York City, but then across sort of the Eastern Seaboard, into rural areas of those states, and then further out into the Midwest. The orphan trains were founded by a person by the name of Charles Loring Brace. He was a New York City minister who noticed that there were a lot of homeless children in the streets. They had formed, at a certain point, formed gangs for survival. Charles Loring Brace also founded the Children's Aid Society shortly after, I guess, noticing this issue in 1853. And what's important here is that Brace believed that street children would have better lives if they left poverty and sort of quote unquote debauchery of gang life in New York City, and were instead raised by morally upright farm families. And what's important there is that, of course, as farming was expanding at the time out in the Midwest, there was also a very recognizable need for labor. And so the idea was that perhaps, these families would be really happy to receive these children. They were morally upstanding, and would be happy to have them and treat them as their own. And so this program, the Orphan Train program, was the precursor to modern foster care in 1930. So the punchline here is that concretely, child welfare began the practice of placing children in homes for their benefit, began as a way of removing poverty from our site and shipping it off, presumably as free labor somewhere else. This is similar, but slightly different to what we know of as Native American boarding schools. Which were begun formally in 1819 as a result of the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. And boarding school, in essence, was established for Native children in an effort to quote unquote civilize and Christianize them. So the idea was that to better assimilate Native children into American society, they needed to be taught European education and, of course, be stripped of any indigeneity that might remain from whence they came. And so this picture specifically is from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So when we think about child welfare, and we think about the history of that system, we have concrete evidence that it began as a way of removing poverty and quarantining it in a different location in the hopes that that quarantine would result in morality, frankly, in indoctrination into sort of the middle class, presumably, although we can sort of argue about that. The next system I want to think about is criminal justice, and specifically police forces. So the modern day precursor to police forces in the United States are slave patrols. More specifically, in the South, the southern United States, slaveholding states, they were outrightly called slave patrols. In the northern states, they were termed night watches. And in fact, some of you may have experienced, walking through a neighborhood, maybe your own neighborhood, and you'll see those blue and white signs that signal a night watch. There's an active night watch here, presumably be careful about what you're doing because we're watching you do it. In the North, night watches were particularly popular, but they were a little bit before the Fugitive Slave Act. They were a little bit more about sort of safeguarding property at night and supporting illicit business. So sort of, protecting people as they were walking home drunk, protecting people who were visiting brothels and things like that. But after 1793, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was very, very contentious at the time, but was fortified in 1850, those night watches then were sort of employed to also support the capture of fugitive slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed for that capture in any US state or territory, regardless of whether that state or territory was a slaveholding state or a slave friendly state, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so in 1850, it was refortified and levied incredibly hard punishments on a person or entity that was known or suspected of interfering with the capture of any fugitive slave. And so these two forces, slave patrol in the South, night watches in the North, were the modern day precursors to police departments, which were again meant to surveil physical areas and again, quarantine a specific subset of people and presumably turn them over to the ends of sort of reifying where we wanted them to be in society at that particular moment in time. Relatedly, the next thing I want to talk about is redlining. So redlining was a federally sanctioned practice that sort of ranked areas in terms of credit risk. And the federal sanctioning here occurred with the National Housing, the National Housing Act of 1934 and the establishment of HOLC, also known as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which established the sort of the first mortgaging body. You can think of it as a precursor to Fannie and Freddie, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Sort of federally holding mortgage securities. So this practice of ranking areas for credit risk was in essence ranking areas in terms of their demographic distribution. And so the more diverse an area was, then the riskier it was to extend credit in that specific area. And today we know redlined communities by a couple of different names. Under the Clinton administration, they were empowerment zones, or that might have been Bush Jr. or Sr., can't remember. Under Obama, they were called promise zones. They were also known as renewal communities, enterprise communities. Colloquially, they're known as the hood, the ghetto, or today, gentrifying areas, areas that are up and coming. And what's really important about this is that the reason these neighborhoods exist in the way they do is because they were specifically designed to be that way, right? Federal legislation, as you might be gathering across this talk, federal legislation supported and actively worked to ensure that this was the way that society functioned, right? So in the case of redlining, mortgage products, which are understood to be the sort of driving force of the middle class, especially after World War II, were specifically kept from specific populations. And more to the point, any land that was sold was also, again, very specifically kept from specific populations. And so what you're looking at here is from the Seattle Civil Rights Labor History Project, but there are actually quite a few of these projects across a variety of institutions across the United States. And in essence, what this is demonstrating is racially restrictive covenants in Seattle. And so what you can do is if you go to this site, you can click on any of these circles and you can read very specifically what deeds two homes said about different races living in different places. The most infamous example of this is, of course, Levittown, New York. Levittown is in what is now Nassau County, at the time is also Nassau County, which we might know as Long Island. Levittown was developed by Levitt and Sons, which were developers who, after World War II, took advantage of the GI Bill. So the GI Bill, in case you don't know, was a set of federal policies that were, in essence, a stimulus to returning veterans from World War II. And it allowed for, access to education, mortgages, and so on, by allowing, by making interest rates very low for veterans. And so Levittown very specifically had similar racially restrictive covenants. And again, if you can sort of read them yourself, but if we look at Alderbrook Park, Division 1, no person of any race other than the white or Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race, domiciled with an owner or a tenant. In essence, you could be Black here if you were part of the help. And more to the point, really a small Google Scholar search will show you that this is stuff that folks have been documenting very well in social science for a great deal of time. And we actually know quite a bit about it. The problem here, of course, is that the people who are doing this work aren't social scientists and may not necessarily speak computer science language, and vice versa. Computer scientists may or may not be actively engaged in sort of reading some of this work. And so the problem that we have when we think about algorithmic bias and AI for good is, of course, that a lot of the training to be a computer scientist or a data scientist, at least, again, in my experience, certainly some of that is changing now, especially in the last 2 years. But previously there was this idea that, you kind of move fast and break stuff, right? And you just kind of build your stuff and get out there and, go and be somebody. But the problem, of course, is that the stuff that is being broken was already broken to begin with, right? And so now we're just kind of making a bigger mess. So let's be very clear about what I'm trying to say is this second problem, and that is that we're using data that was compiled to survey and then quarantine people, and we're asking that same data to help us free them. And so you can understand what the paradox is, right? We're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, or whatever the analogy is there. In social science and in more sort of critical discourse spaces, we think about this problem as using the master's tools to break down his house, right? And of course, the problem there, at least in critical discourse, as far as I understand, is that it turns out you can't. It turns out it doesn't work. At least it hasn't worked so far, not in the ways that we've done it, right? Which leads me to the third problem, which is our general attitude about social good. And that is the most good for the greatest number, right? And this is an argument that comes from a branch of philosophy known as utilitarianism. And in essence, utilitarianism can be defined as, an action is right as long as it promotes happiness. And the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people should be the thing that guides our work. And this is really how we think about social policy in the United States, at least. The problem is threefold here. The first is who defines good? Good for who? And of course, who gets left out? Because utilitarianism requires that there is always a margin, because it's the greatest number for the most. And if it happens to be everybody, great, but we don't really need to get to everyone. We just need to get to the most. And we can define the most as just simply more than 50%. We'd technically be right there, right? Here's where I think social work comes in, because social work is principally concerned with the margins. And what I'd like to offer here is my own definition of social work, which is that the function of social work in society, in modern society today, is to mitigate market failure. In essence, everyone that capitalism doesn't work for, social work catches. The problem, of course, is that there's a lot of people that need catching now. But yet and still, the closest that social work has come to defining this, what we understand as social justice, is from John Rawls's work on redistributive justice, also known as the difference principle. And so the difference principle is comprised of two propositions. The first is that every person has an equal claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic rights and liberties. And the second, and maybe where social work tends to spend more of its time, is that social and economic inequalities must satisfy two conditions. The first is that they are to be attached to positions and offices that are open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. In other words, that social and economic inequality should be everyone in any society should be equally subject to social and economic inequality. It should not be overrepresented in one population or the other. And the second portion of this proposition is that everything should, social and economic inequalities, anything that we do to work on those things should be of greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. And so social work spends a lot of time right at this particular portion of the difference principle, benefiting the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. The problem, of course, is that social work is as flawed and as nearsighted as the rest of you, right? All of us cannot see the back of our own necks, right? And so what I'd like to propose today is what I think is the best path forward to sort of not only mitigate algorithmic bias, but to actively work towards AI for social good. And that is a concept I call sort of centering the margins. And there's three prerequisites to centering the margins. The first is to call a thing a thing. And what I mean by that is that maybe algorithmic bias isn't so much bias as it is scaling how society currently functions, right? And the way that society currently functions is that we actively make a specific intersection of identities more important than the rest of us, because those who were in power designed society to perpetuate their power in others who shared their positions, right? So if eventually we can agree on this, the second prerequisite is that we have to stop assuming that the future will look like the past. So a priori information, as we understand from sort of Bayesian statistics, which is one of the key sort of innovations that led to the scaling of machine learning in the way that it has, is a priori information is useful for events that we want to be stable, like population growth or disease mitigation, right? But for things that we're looking to change, predicting the future based on the past makes us beholden to the patterns that came before, right? So this negates the work of the present. And it means that we're digging the hole deeper and not acknowledging that it's our own fault we fell into the hole, instead of simply walking down a new street. The third prerequisite is that you cannot know what you have not experienced. And what I mean by this is, I tell students all the time, in my opinion, people who are attracted to social work as a profession and as a field of inquiry are, in my experience, and again, in my opinion, people who have had their hearts broken and have vowed that nobody else will have their heart broken in quite the same way. And maybe that's because they witnessed homelessness, they experienced homelessness, for example, or they experienced some other social ill, and they were so moved by that, right? that they vowed to sort of work on that perpetually. But the problem, of course, is that, you know, we're off to the races, you know, looking to save everyone without having kind of first saved ourselves. And we know this from social work practice as well. It's, I think accepted knowledge that some of the best substance abuse counselors are people who are in recovery themselves, because they've touched that pain. They know what it's like to be in such a place of despair. And they're maybe the best guide to kind of lead you out, right? Or at least to help you lead yourself out, certainly. And so what, in the context of algorithmic bias, what I'm saying is that you cannot know what bias is unless you're actively touching that experience, the experience of being marginalized yourself. We've all experienced it, but maybe not all of us are in touch with that experience, or maybe we're not exposed to it at the same rate or at the same propensity as other folks. And so the people who are expert in whatever problem you as a technologist, as a developer, as an engineer, the problem that you're looking to address, the people who are perhaps most expert at it are the people who are actively living and surviving in it today. And even more to the point, the folks who are actively thriving under those conditions. So AI has to center those populations in order to do any good. And this requires actual team science. And so what I have here is a citation of Desmond Patton's group over at Columbia University. And this is a quote from this work that really, I think, speaks to this, which is that in the work that they did here, which used youth who were gang involved to sort of develop annotations for social media posts that may or may not be related to gun violence or gang activity, for example. What they did was that they integrated domain insights into the production of algorithms. In other words, the youth who were actively looking to intervene with were team members and built the solution, helped build the solution to annotating the text that they were looking to understand. And so what you might be thinking now is, well, how do I actually do this? Well, so here are a series of questions that I'd like you to ask yourself and your teams if you're actively looking to engage in AI for social good through this mechanism of team science. And the first is to ask yourself, who stands to lose the most by what you're looking to build? Who is the most marginalized? Who is in the position of least power? Where are they? What do you know about them? And most importantly, do they trust you? And if you can answer this question, then it's possible that you may be ready for the next step. Do you have time to build trust? In business, there is a concept known as the holy triangle. And that is, in any product, anything that you're looking to build, there are three key legs: cost, quality, and time. And any business major will tell you, you can only ever have two. If you don't have time to build trust, stop immediately. Because you're going to move fast and you're going to break stuff. And the stuff you're going to break is already broken. So stop. But if you do have time, here's what I would propose. First, on your team, and it needs to be a team, there must be social scientists. And at least one of those people has to be a social worker. And I know you're thinking, well, that's really self-serving, Dr. Rodriguez. And maybe a little bit. But again, if you remember from the beginning of my talk, social work is fundamentally concerned with the margins. And we are fundamentally actively engaged in catching and working with the margins. And more to the point, we don't care about fairness as much as we care about justice. And that is a perspective that is required in any endeavor that calls itself AI for social good or some derivative. The second is that you must add representatives of the target population to your team as co-engineers, co-developers, and they must outnumber the AI folks on the team. And the reason they must outnumber you is because you are going to be socialized into already ignoring them, right? Because that's how society functions. We've established this, right? The third thing that you must do is you must be clear about the time commitment that is involved, and you must pay them cash according to their level of commitment. I don't want to see another gift card as long as I live. Right? No in kind. We could talk about why not, right? But it has to do with the English poor laws. Anyway, pay them cash. Pay them well. And lastly, but maybe most importantly, make sure that those folks are co-authors on any work that is about them, including their data. Does it matter to, a homeless mom of two whether or not she's a co-author on your paper published in JAMA? No, it doesn't. But it is a nod to the fact that you did not produce that work on your own. And it is respectful of that person's energy, which they have shared with you by giving you their time, but most importantly, their suffering to you to then use to build your algorithm. So in summary, here are the punchlines. Maybe algorithmic bias isn't really bias as much as it is algorithmic scaling. And I admit that that's maybe not the best term, so I'm open to other titles. But in essence, it's how the world functions at scale, exponentiated, right? What we see in algorithmic output is just the way that society actually works today. To that end, fairness is not justice, because what works for most leaves a lot of people out, and this is not sustainable. What we need, and more importantly, what we deserve, is justice. And so actual team science takes work, but again, cost, quality, and time, and you can only have two. And it'll create, so it takes work, but it will take work to create the world that we want to actually see, not the world that we've been in. And so to be very clear, I believe algorithms can help if we design them to value the populations that society has deemed less valuable. And if you're unsure where to start with Black femme women. Because across most demographic outcomes, everywhere from health to wealth, with the exception of higher educational achievement, Black femme women are perhaps the most disadvantaged by the structures of society as they exist today. And so what we do with that is we begin with equity and strategically work our way towards equality. And what I mean by that is we give to each according to their need, moving towards a place where we all then can have the same. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll take your questions, comments, critiques, etc.
I'm sure if we were live, there would be thunderous applause. That was absolutely fantastic. And I know as a center that we aspire to a lot of the values that you're talking about here. I'm sure that there are people who have questions or comments that they want to add. I don't know if folks know that there's a Q&A button, and you could also put it into the chat to the panelists. Either of those will work. I see a couple of questions popping up. So I don't know if you can see these, Maria, but there's one in the Q&A that is I'll just read it for those who can't maybe follow along. It's going to help if the definition of happiness is restricted to housing of one room per person in theory of justice and working with the greatest amount of happiness for everyone. So I guess this is asking for a little bit of clarification about sort of how you're thinking about justice and happiness and how that works.
Yeah, thank you. And if the person who asked the question, if they have any clarifications that they want to sort of send in, I'll be free to take those as well. But in essence, the definition of justice, at least again, as far as that it has been theorized in social work, and again, there's certainly room for improvement, is that we should be inequalities in society. Happiness is knowing that you have just as equal a chance of experiencing some terrible downfall as your neighbor, regardless of any demographic position that you might hold. That would be my particular definition of happiness in the context of society, right? I have just as much chance as Eric of experiencing the same, God forbid, calamity, regardless of any demographic characteristics that I have and any demographic characteristics that Eric might have. That would be justice. And I would argue happiness in a societal context. So I hope that answers this question. Feel free to let me know if it doesn't. Do you want me to keep reading?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Please.
cool. So I'm gonna go with the second question that's in the Q&A, and then I'll take a look at the chat. So Zara asks, as a student, what's the best way to start moving towards or working on getting justice in tech? That's a great question. So I think the very first is that it is imperative that you speak to people outside of your particular field. And what I mean by that is when I was in my doctoral program, maybe a little bit less so in my master's program, but in my doctoral program, I spent hardly any time in social work because I felt that I had a pretty good handle on what social work was at the time. And of course, I'm sure that some of my colleagues might disagree. But I knew that I needed some other information, particularly from the places that thought about the kind of intersection of problems that I cared about. So that meant I spent a lot of time in computer science, in political science, in sociology. And admittedly, I spent a good deal of time confused, especially in those early years, as I learned the languages that were being spoken, right? So just because we all speak, for example, English doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the same stuff when we're using certain words. And so the one particular piece of concrete advice I would give is to start talking to other people, particularly people in fields that are studying things that you may or may not have the chance to study. One of my biggest sadnesses is that I have this collection of books and I've only read about a third of them because there's only so much time and you can't see the back of your own neck. So talk to as many people that are different from yourself as you possibly can. You'd be surprised how friendly people actually are. And let's see, so Ellen Haig, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. This is a social work question. Given that schools of social work are generally responsive to the CSWE's guidance on social work education, how can we prepare modern social workers for this issue now without waiting for the bureaucratic machine? I'm currently an MSW student and an IT worker. Thank you. And we have not talked about technology once in my program. Ellen, that's phenomenal. That is phenomenal. And I happen to know that there are a few institutions, a few schools of social work that are actively thinking about this. Obviously USC, School of Social Work, Penn, Columbia, certainly the University at Buffalo is also thinking about it and is actively engaged in different pieces of it. But I would say that this is where we can take a little lesson from computer science as social workers, and that is, it is sometimes better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And what I mean by that is that in terms of curriculum development, right, building, sort of actively working with the folks who are at this intersection, but if you yourself, it sounds like, are at this intersection, then actively promoting the work that you're doing and talking to as many people as possible about what you're doing until you sort of get to a friendly person. Certainly in this webinar, I think you could probably already tell that, you know, Eric Rice is one such person. I'm one such person. Desmond Patton at Columbia, Lori Goldkind at Fordham, my colleague, Melanie Sage at the University of Buffalo, my current dean, Nancy Smith at the University of Buffalo. There are some of us who are maybe coming, you know, more out into the forefront. And so, one, you're not alone. And two, maybe ask for forgiveness and do what it is you want to do first anyway.
I love that line. I often live by it.
Yeah. Sometimes you might get in trouble, but then you can just kind of say, hey, I didn't know I couldn't do that.
Beg for forgiveness, right?
Yeah, I didn't know I couldn't do that. I'm so sorry. But yeah, so are there any other questions, comments, thoughts? Let me check out the Q&A.
There's another one in the Q&A now.
Okay. Do you think social justice can be practiced by any person in any circumstance? I imagine that it would be hard for people who are currently struggling in their own situation to put in effort to correcting social injustices when they're not stable themselves. 110,000%, right? So this is often when I used to be a community organizer in North Philadelphia. And one of the main things I learned is you never ask people for their time without paying for them to get to you, paying for them to leave you, and paying for their food when they come see you. Especially if the people you're talking to, again, have an overburdened cognitive load. If I need to figure out how I'm gonna eat, how I'm gonna live, how I'm gonna move, then if you want me to talk to you, you need to take care of that for me so that I have space, right? So that I can breathe and be present with you, right? But I also think that, you know, I think there's quite a few studies in certainly sociology and human services that sort of demonstrate that the people who tend to give the most money to charitable organizations are the people with the least to give, right? So again, and the point I'm making there is that it would be incorrect to assume that people who are under a lot of stress don't have time, don't want to speak to you. But it would be correct to assume that you need to do something to free up their mind and their time and their money and their pocket so that they're able to be present with you and speak with you, especially if what you want to talk about is something completely abstract, right? But I can't tell you how many people's homes I've been in, again, especially as a community organizer, when I used to cold knock on people's doors. I can't tell you how many times people invited me in to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or gave me literally the food in their refrigerator just because I wanted to spend time with them. So there's a question about recording. I do think it is being recorded. So maybe, is it going to be posted somewhere?
Sorry, I muted myself. We will post it if you go to the CAIS website. So it's cais.usc.edu. There we have some tabs that guide you to where our past presentations have been, and you can watch all of them. And it takes us usually a couple of days to post it up online, but it will be available there.
Okay, I see there's a question in the Q&A, and then there's also a question in the chat. So I'll go with the question in the Q&A first, and then hopefully get to the chat too. This question is from Monica Carter. What led you to choose social work and social welfare over computer or data science? I don't know that I've chosen yet. I don't know that I've chosen yet, but I will say that it's a very personal thing for, at least for me. The reason I'm an academic is because it is my job to hold the door open, the same way that it was held open for me. And in fact, when I was going off to my PhD program, my activist friends sat me down and they were like, what is getting a PhD going to do? Who is that going to help? And I said, well, if there's at least one person who looks like me, who comes from where I come from, who can have conversations at different tables and again, hold the door open, then maybe, maybe that's helpful. And so they made me a t-shirt that I have to this day that says the analyzer, distill and convey. And so they kind of gave me my marching orders. And so here I am, just trying my best to be of service. I don't think it really matters whether it's in social work or computer science. It's just kind of where I can do the most good right now. And the last, or at least maybe not the last, but certainly the question in the chat is from Brenda Wywell. Please forgive me if I mispronounced your last name. Amazing and powerful, thank you. How do we address use of AI where other disciplines are already engaged in projects that intersect social good and maybe using it in ways that are actually replicating and reproducing harmful social systems? Yes. This is a good question. I think the first is to not panic, which I feel a lot actually, especially when I'm in different rooms and I'm like, oh my God, what is happening? But concretely, there are plenty of spaces that are actively working to push themselves and each other towards this nexus of what I understand as actual team science, what other people maybe call interdisciplinary work or maybe transdisciplinary, right, is really kind of where we're trying to get to. So examples of those places are FACT, the Conference for Fairness, Accuracy, and Transparency, or sorry, Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning. Another one is Mechanical Design for Social Good, and there's a couple of other sort of derivatives of for social good, where those are spaces where there are people who are, at least in my experience, there are people there who are actively engaged in the work of becoming comfortable being uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is understanding that we are currently actively perpetuating what we don't want to see, and those spaces are actively pushing themselves and therefore each other to expand their understanding of fairness, again, maybe in this direction of justice, and are looking to intervene. So you can go on, if you Google FACCT conference, then you'll see this year's conference, which was just last week or 2 weeks ago. Time means nothing anymore, so I don't really know. But you'll see some of those topics there, and it's it's everything from is one of the really interesting papers was around causal counterfactual analysis, right? Which is one of the things that's being touted now is like, well, maybe we can address algorithmic bias by looking at counterfactuals. Of course, some of the problems there is like, well, if you don't have the data for counterfactuals, then what are you going to do? Well, you can simulate it, right? And then we run into some other problems, but maybe we're getting somewhere there, right? I actually think that maybe there's a lot of good that can come from there if we can kind of figure that out. But there are spaces, especially now. And one of the things I tell my community organizing students is that it's important to remember that there has always been resistance. The problem is that, history is written by the winners. But the margins are still there. And they remember how it how it really went down, maybe.
Well, it's 60 seconds or so left in our hour. So you've I think the questions and your time for answers were exactly synchronous, so that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for such a wonderful talk, and one that I know is inspiring. I know for sure because I've gotten some sidebar texts saying, "Oh my gosh, she's so great," and I was like, "I know." Right? So thank you for being a source of inspiration for many, and maybe a challenging voice for some as well, which I think is always a good thing to do as well. And just a little teaser for those of you here on the call. I mean, we're doing a symposium on AI and equity April 15th and 16th, and Dr. Rodriguez is going to be one of our keynote speakers there as well. So if you want to hear more from her, you can sign up for that as well, which is another free event that CAIS is hosting, and you can go to our website to navigate your way there. So thank you very much. I wish that we could have a big round of applause that you could hear. But I'm sure that others And have a wonderful afternoon. And to the rest of the audience, you all have a wonderful afternoon as well. And join us again next time.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for having me. Be well.
Thank you.